I thought I was just there to fix her heater, but the real warmth she needed had nothing to do with the cold. When my phone buzzed that afternoon, it was just another service call on the list. A woman needed her heater repaired. Nothing unusual, nothing worth thinking twice about. I packed up my tools, expecting an ordinary job, a routine visit that would end with me tightening a few bolts and sending an invoice. But the moment I turned onto her street, a strange anticipation stirred in me. The houses there stood quiet and dignified, lined with tall trees whose bare branches swayed gently in the winter breeze. Her house, set slightly back from the others, glowed with the amber light of early evening, its windows spilling warmth into the chill of dusk. When she opened the door, I forgot the rehearsed line I usually gave about being here to take a look. She was nothing like the customers I normally dealt with. She stood with a grace that wasn't forced, her poise soft but undeniable. Mid-40s, I guessed, though the years sat lightly on her, as if time itself had decided to be kind. She had a presence that filled the space before a single word was spoken. The air between us carried a faint trace of her perfume, something elegant, not overwhelming, a fragrance that made me instantly aware of how ordinary my work jacket smelled in comparison. She smiled politely, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something unguarded, something that told me this wasn't just about a broken heater. Her voice was calm and steady when she said, "Come in, it's colder than I expected tonight." The way she gestured me inside wasn't hurried. It was as though she was inviting me not just into her house, but into a pause in her evening, a pause that mattered more than she let on. The hallway was softly lit, shadows stretching along the polished wooden floor. My boots felt too heavy, my presence too loud in a home that seemed built for quieter company. She led me to the living room where the heater sat against the far wall, an older model humming weakly as though it had given up halfway through its job. I crouched beside it, setting down my toolbox, the clink of metal echoing in the stillness. But I couldn't ignore the feeling of her presence just a few feet behind me. She didn't wander off like most customers do. Instead, she hovered gently, not intruding, not impatient, but watchful. I caught the soft sound of her breathing, steady and near. I remember thinking that most houses I visited carried a background noise of chaos, kids running, televisions humming, phones ringing. But hers carried something else, a stillness that was beautiful and unsettling at the same time. As I pulled a wrench from my kit, I glanced up. She was standing in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, her arms crossed loosely. The lamplight behind her haloed the edges of her hair, and for just a second, I forgot about the heater altogether. I told myself to focus, to keep things professional. Yet, even in those first few minutes, I sensed it. The heater might have been the reason I was called, but it wasn't the reason I was here. The heater's metal casing was cool beneath my hands as I ran my fingers along the edges, checking for loose screws, listening to the half-hearted hum of its motor. It wasn't entirely broken, just tired, struggling, like an old voice that had lost its strength. I set my tools down carefully, the soft clink of metal filling the silence. Behind me, I could sense her presence like a quiet weight in the room. Most people, once I started working, disappeared into their routines, making calls, finishing dinner, anything to fill the time. But she lingered. Not impatiently, not hovering to make sure I wasn't cutting corners, but in a way that made me feel noticed. Her footsteps crossed the wooden floor once, light and unhurried, as she moved to the window. She pulled the curtain back a few inches, letting in a thread of fading daylight, then let it fall again. I didn't look up, but I felt the shift in the room, the small things you pick up on when someone's presence is the only sound. "Do you need tea?" she asked after a while, her voice soft, but carrying clearly through the stillness. I hesitated, wrench in hand. It wasn't really about the tea, was it? People don't usually ask twice. They just bring it, set it down, move on. But her offer lingered in the air as if she wanted me to say yes, as if the ritual of pouring, sipping, sharing silence would give us both a reason to stretch this moment longer. "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, though a part of me almost regretted turning it down. She hummed softly in response, not disappointed, just thoughtful, and returned to her place near the doorway. From the corner of my eye, I caught the way she folded her arms, her sleeve brushing lightly against her wrist, her expression unreadable in the golden lamplight. The heater groaned as I adjusted the valve, a puff of lukewarm air escaping before fading again. I focused on the mechanics, but my mind kept drifting toward her presence, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the faint rustle when she shifted her weight, the subtle warmth radiating from where she stood. Silence stretched between us, not heavy but charged, like a pause in music where you know the next note will matter. I realized I wasn't uncomfortable in it. In fact, it felt like she was letting me into a space few others were allowed to occupy, the kind of silence that reveals instead of hides. As I leaned closer to the heater, I felt a strand of hair fall over my forehead, and almost instinctively, she stepped forward. Not to touch me, she didn't cross that line, but I could sense the shift, the nearness of her shadow blending with mine for just a second before she caught herself and stopped. I tightened the last screw, listening to the faint, uneven hum of the machine. It wasn't fixed yet, but I couldn't shake the thought that the heater wasn't the only thing in this room struggling to hold its warmth. I glanced up finally, meeting her eyes. She didn't look away. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and half-lit lamplight, I understood. The heater was just an excuse. The real story was happening in the space between us. The heater gave a reluctant sigh as it sputtered back to life, the faint hum barely warming the air. I leaned back on my heels, wiped my hands against my jeans, and told her it would take a while before the room felt any difference. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she was listening to my words as much as watching the way I said them. "Sit for a moment," she said quietly, almost as if she were offering me a reprieve from more than just work. I hesitated, part of me reminding myself I was just the repairman, another part curious, drawn in by something I couldn't explain. Eventually, I lowered myself onto the sofa across from hers. She poured tea this time without asking again, and when she placed the cup in my hands, the warmth of it felt sharper than the failing heater behind me. At first, our words were ordinary. I told her the heater was old, that it might need replacing soon. She smiled faintly and said, "A lot of things in this house are older than they should be." The way she said it carried more weight than I expected. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where dusk was deepening into night, and for a moment I thought the conversation had ended. But then she added, almost to herself, "It's not really the cold that bothers me. It's the quiet." The words hung between us, soft yet disarming. I looked at her more closely. She wasn't dramatic in her confession. There were no trembling hands, no theatrics. Just an honest statement from someone who'd grown used to her own company for too long. "I guess I know what you mean," I admitted, surprising myself. Silence can feel heavy when there's no one to share it with. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time, she truly studied me, not as a worker fixing her heater, but as a man sitting in her living room, speaking truths he maybe hadn't spoken aloud before. The intensity of her gaze made my chest tighten, though she softened it a moment later with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We sat there, sipping tea, while the seconds stretched. The sound of the wind pressing against the window filled the gaps in our conversation. I became acutely aware of everything, the steam curling from her cup, the way she cradled it with both hands as if grounding herself, the faint reflection of lamplight in her hair. When she set her cup down, her hand rested lightly on the cushion beside her, fingers relaxed, but close enough that I noticed. I shifted slightly, my own hand brushing the rim of my cup just to keep from fidgeting. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence she'd spoken of earlier. This was a silence filled with possibility, with something alive just beneath the surface. In that stillness, I realized time wasn't moving at its usual pace. It had slowed, stretched, wrapped itself around us like a blanket. And even though the heater was humming louder now, the warmth I felt had nothing to do with machinery. It came from the way she let herself be seen, and the way she, in turn, seemed to truly see me. By the time I had tightened the last screw, the heater gave a steady, low hum, not perfect, but alive again. A faint current of warm air spread through the room, brushing against my skin, though it felt almost unnecessary. The real warmth was already here. I straightened up and dusted my hands, trying to remind myself of why I was here. Professionalism. Finish the job, pack the tools, leave politely. But when I turned, she was sitting on the sofa, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed not on the heater, but on me. It should hold for a while, I said, my voice sounding too loud in the soft stillness. At least through the season. She nodded, but her expression didn't shift. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was searching for the right words. Then, with a gentleness that carried more weight than any sharp confession, she spoke. The heat isn't the problem. The words landed with a quiet force. I froze, unsure if I had misheard, but the look in her eyes left no room for doubt. She wasn't talking about the heater. She wasn't even talking about the air in the room. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Part of me wanted to deflect, to laugh lightly, to pretend I hadn't caught the deeper meaning. But I couldn't. Her voice had been too steady, too intentional. She leaned back slightly against the sofa, her posture calm, but her eyes betraying a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. You fix things, she said softly, almost more to herself than to me. But not everything can be fixed with a wrench. My chest tightened. I should have responded with something careful, something neutral. Yet silence seemed like the only honest answer I could give. The heater clicked faintly in the background, filling the space where words should have been. I stood there, tools still in my hand, suspended between the role I was supposed to play and the role she had just offered me. Her gaze held mine. Not demanding, not pleading, but steady. It was as if she was allowing me the choice to acknowledge what had just passed between us, or to retreat into the safe walls of professionalism. I sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa, careful to leave space, though the air between us felt charged. Then what is the problem? I asked finally, my voice quieter than I expected. She smiled faintly, but it wasn't amusement. It was sadness softened by honesty. It's the kind of cold you feel even when the room is warm. Her words sank into me, heavy and undeniable. I understood. Maybe not the details, not the history, but the feeling. The kind of loneliness that no amount of heat could thaw. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the low hum of the machine, faithfully doing its job while the real warmth unfolded, slowly, between us. Our eyes lingered, longer than they should have, and in that unspoken exchange I felt it. She hadn't called me just to fix the heater. She had called me because she needed someone to notice. And now that I had, nothing between us felt the same. The heater was repaired, the tea had gone lukewarm, and yet neither of us moved to declare the evening finished. That in itself said something. Normally, when a job is done, there's a rhythm that follows, a polite thank you, a handshake, the shuffle of boots back out the door. But here, the moment stretched, as if both of us silently agreed to let time hesitate with us. She shifted slightly on the sofa, adjusting a cushion as though it suddenly mattered, then let her hands rest loosely in her lap. I sat on the opposite end, close enough to feel the gentle warmth from her side of the couch, but far enough that the space between us hummed with possibility. Every detail sharpened under the weight of that silence. The faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. The way her sleeve brushed her wrist when she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The soft rhythm of her breathing, calm but not unaffected. I caught myself listening more closely than I should, as though memorizing the sound. When I reached for my cup, our hands nearly touched. It wasn't deliberate, the kind of accidental brush that could be dismissed in an instant, but it sent a pulse through me, as though the air itself had shifted. She didn't pull back right away. Instead, her fingers lingered for the briefest heartbeat, enough for me to notice, enough for me to wonder if it had been intentional. I cleared my throat softly, more to steady myself than to fill the silence. It seems the heater's holding now, I said, the words thinner than I intended. She glanced at the machine, then back at me, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. Yes, but the room already feels warmer, doesn't it? The way she said it wasn't playful, yet it wasn't heavy either. It balanced in that delicate space where honesty and restraint meet. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with the awareness of how close we were to crossing into something unspoken. Her eyes lingered on mine longer this time. Not boldly, Not in a way that demanded anything, but with a quiet openness that seemed to ask a question without words. And I didn't know how to answer. My mind kept circling back to the reality of who we were. She was older, graceful in ways that made me feel both young and clumsy. I was supposed to be the one fixing a heater, not sitting here caught in the pull of her presence. What would people think if they saw us like this? Yet, the longer I sat there, the less those thoughts felt like reasons to move away. She shifted slightly closer, her shoulder brushing against mine. It was subtle, maybe even accidental, but it made my pulse quicken. The warmth of that simple touch eclipsed everything else, the heater's hum, the ticking clock, even the doubts I'd been clinging to. We sat like that, side by side, saying little, letting the silence do most of the speaking. And though no promises were made, no lines crossed, I knew something had changed. The tension wasn't a question anymore. It was an answer waiting for courage. The longer we sat in that shared quiet, the more impossible it became to ignore what was happening. The heater hummed steadily now, dutiful in its work, yet it felt almost irrelevant. The true warmth in the room wasn't mechanical, it was the fragile current passing between us, a current I didn't quite know how to handle. She was the one who broke the silence first. Her voice was soft, but steady, the kind of tone people use when they've rehearsed their words 100 times, but still hesitate before letting them go. "I didn't really call you just for the heater," she admitted. The confession settled in the air, not rushed, not desperate, but unflinchingly honest. I turned slightly toward her, my heart beating faster, unsure if I wanted to hear more or if hearing it would undo me completely. "I mean, yes, it needed fixing," she continued, her gaze dropping to her hands folded neatly in her lap. "But mostly, I just needed company. The silence here has been unbearable lately." Her words carried no drama, no performance. Just truth. And somehow, that made them land harder. I found myself staring at her hands, elegant, steady, but betraying a faint tension in the way her fingers pressed lightly against each other. Without thinking, I shifted closer, just enough that the space between us wasn't quite so wide. "I understand," I said quietly. And I meant it. Too much, maybe. She glanced up at me then, eyes searching mine. "Do you?" she asked, as if daring me to prove it. I swallowed, fighting past the voice in my head telling me to be careful. "I do. More than I probably should admit. From the moment I walked in. I felt it. Something here. Something with you." The honesty surprised even me, and yet it felt wrong to hold it back any longer. Her lips parted, a faint, almost incredulous smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You're much younger than me," she said softly, though the words sounded less like a warning and more like a test. I nodded, unable to deny it. "Yes, but that doesn't change what I feel. Maybe it should, but it doesn't." She exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight she'd been carrying for years. "You make me feel seen," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the heater. "Do you know how rare that is? To be really seen?" Her hand shifted then, almost shyly, brushing against mine where it rested on the sofa. She didn't grip it, didn't claim it, just tested the space, waiting to see if I would retreat. I didn't. Instead, I turned my palm up, allowing her fingers to slip into mine. The warmth of that touch was overwhelming in its simplicity. No grand gestures, no declarations, just the quiet truth of two people choosing not to pull away. I could feel the doubts circling, the difference in our ages, what others might say, the blurred line between circumstance and choice. But none of it mattered as much as the feel of her hand in mine. In that moment, vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the very thing holding us together. The heater was steady now, humming like a heartbeat in the corner of the room. The warmth spread evenly through the space, but the truth was undeniable. I no longer noticed the difference between warm air and cold. What I felt came entirely from the woman sitting beside me, her hand resting inside mine as if it had always belonged there. Neither of us spoke at first. There was no need. The silence, once heavy with loneliness, had changed. It was no longer something to endure, it was something we shared, something that carried its own kind of closeness. After a while, she leaned back slightly, her shoulder brushing against mine. The touch was small, casual enough to be dismissed, but the weight of it settled deep inside me. My chest rose and fell slower now, each breath steadying against the rhythm of hers. "You should probably be going," she said softly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Probably," I admitted. But I didn't move. Neither did she. Her eyes lingered on me, studying my face as though committing it to memory. In that gaze, I saw both her strength and her vulnerability, the confident woman who had greeted me at the door, and the quiet soul who had just confessed to calling me because silence had become too much. Both of those women were real, and somehow, both of them were here with me. She lowered her gaze then, almost shyly, and whispered, "I don't know what this is, or what it could be, but I don't want to pretend it isn't here." The words struck something inside me: relief, recognition, a truth I hadn't been brave enough to say aloud myself. I squeezed her hand gently, the way someone does when words would only diminish the meaning. "Neither do I murmured. Her smile was faint, but it reached her eyes this time. She shifted closer, her head finding its place against my shoulder. The weight was light, yet grounding, as though she was trusting me with something fragile. I let my free hand rest lightly over hers, fingers brushing against her knuckles, feeling the subtle strength beneath the softness. The room glowed with lamplight, shadows stretching gently across the floor. Outside, the world was quiet, the wind had settled, the night had grown calm. And in that stillness, for the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor in her home. I felt like I belonged. We didn't talk about tomorrow, or the weight of years between us, or the opinions of others. Tonight wasn't about answers or promises. Tonight was about allowing ourselves to feel the warmth we had both been missing. As her breathing slowed against me, steady and trusting, I realized I wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. I was simply there with her in this moment that felt suspended outside of time. The heater had been fixed. But the real repair, the quiet mending of two hearts, had only just begun.